And tonight we're joined by Rebecca Long-Bailey and Grace Blakeley. And this evening is hosted by Arise, a festival of Labour's left ideas, along with the Labour Assembly Against Austerity and media partner Labour Outlook. And this event, so that people new to the series, we're having a series of conversation events which are hosted by Arise, and the idea is that by having a couple of speakers we can have a more in-depth discussion on ideas and socialist political education. So in respect of this one tonight, we've really seen how around the world we've got governments are completely failing to protect people's lives and livelihoods, and our government is one of those that has failed most of all, where we've got an ongoing public health crisis which is also fast becoming an economic crisis. They've failed to stop the spread of the virus getting out of control again, and they're also failing to give people the economic support they so desperately need. So our government has failed to extend the furlough scheme in any meaningful way. We've got statutory sick pay at an incredibly low level still, and they remain obsessed with privatisation and the outsourcing of our public services, despite the disaster of Serco and the test and trace system. So I think this discussion tonight comes at a really crucial time, both in terms of the immediate and very urgent demands, but also what it means for the future of our country. I think at the moment we've got the right will be very clear on how they're going to use the pandemic to reshape our society and, of course, Britain's place in the world as we come to the end of this year. Arise is a festival of internationalism and unity. So as well as the events in Britain, we always try and put things within the global context of us facing Trump and his allies, who have obviously played a disastrous role during this pandemic, but also as the globe tips ever closer to uncontrollable and catastrophic climate breakdown. And obviously the US election is upcoming. So finally, a couple of technical announcements. Due to an amazing level of interest, as well as this Zoom webinar, we're streaming live on the Arise YouTube page and on over a dozen Facebook pages. So as the event goes on, you can post questions in the comments below the stream on those pages and in the Q&A section on Zoom, and we'll be putting some of those questions to our speakers tonight. And you can also, please, if you could donate at the link provided so Arise can continue to host events just like this tonight. And another plug quickly before we start. We've got the People's Plan that we're promoting, which an amazing 11,000 Labour members have signed, which is really picking up on the themes of tonight's discussion about how we put people first at the heart of policy. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker tonight, which is the amazing Grace Blakeley. I'm sure people have read her Tribune columnist, her latest couple of books, and basically seen her all over the media, basically putting the left-wing view forward about the type of society and the type of recovery we need. So Grace.
Thanks so much, Sean, and thanks to you and Matt and Arise and Lyle for putting this event on. It's been really great to have these events over the course of the pandemic and of lockdown, and to just get so many people on each of them. So thanks so much for organising it. I'm going to talk a little bit today again about, Sean mentioned that I had a book out, and I do. It is The Corona Crash. You can pre-order it from Verso now. It's out next week properly in shops, but you can, pre-order it from the Verso website today. And basically what I talk about are the kind of economic issues that the pandemic has thrown up, the kind of political economic issues the pandemic has thrown up, how they relate to pre-existing problems that we had in the economy before, and how we can think about rebuilding the economy in a kind of juster and more sustainable way in the wake of the pandemic. So the main, I think, the main question that we have to answer today is how we can avoid another lost decade like the one we had after the financial crisis of 2008. Obviously, it was then the governments all around the world spent billions bailing out bankers, many of whom really didn't face any consequences for their actions whatsoever, while austerity was imposed on working people in the UK and obviously throughout Europe. And as a result of that, we've had really a decade of kind of stagnation. So we had a decade of wage stagnation, productivity stagnation, low levels of investment, a kind of real just lack of dynamism in the economy, which has been particularly acute in the UK for a bunch of different reasons, partly because our economy is so financialized, so dependent upon those sectors that really blew up and then collapsed in the wake of the financial crisis, but also because we have all sorts of long-term problems about low levels of investment, and kind of regional inequalities, high levels of wealth inequality, and a kind of real estate sector and housing sector that is very extractive and financialized, which is, I think, one of the big issues that we've really seen come up in the 10 years since the financial crisis, especially when we're thinking about, the reasons for the political upsets of the last 10 years. It's at least in part been driven by young people feeling like, well, they haven't had a pay rise in 10 years, the public services are kind of being decimated, and they'll never really be able to get on the property ladder no matter how much they save and how much they try. This kind of interlocking set of quite deep-seated issues that have arisen since 2008 have given rise to this kind of long period of stagnation and created all these kind of fragilities that we had in our economy before the pandemic hit. And so as part of there was a kind of longer term trend that we've seen under what I call this kind of model of finance-led growth, kind of financialized capitalism, where the relative power of labor and capital, of workers versus bosses, has shifted. So bosses and capitalists and particular subsections of capital, so for example, financial capital, have become extremely powerful over the last 40 years, and workers have lost quite a lot of power. And that was not a trend that changed during the financial crisis. In fact, if anything, it deepened. So we've seen a precaritization of work, as I said, a kind of levels of wage stagnation that we haven't seen in centuries, really. We've obviously seen the kind of continued erosion of the labour movement, and really a kind of a living standards crisis that's reflected in the fact that there are millions of households in the UK really struggling very severely with problem debts, and with being basically unable to make ends meet. And that was the case even before the pandemic hit. And then, on the other hand, you have the fact that through all sorts of measures put in place by the government, so first the bank bailouts, then quantitative easing, and then actually austerity itself and the kind of changing nature of the public sector, the shift towards privatization, towards outsourcing that was really deepened in the wake of the financial crisis, has empowered particular private interests in British society at the expense of workers. So we had those issues again set in before the pandemic. We also had some kind of very particular economic issues that were driven by this unsustainable model. So basically the balance was that we had very little government spending, especially kind of little government spending on public services, on things that would help the average person. And instead, what the government decided to do was pump tons and tons of money into financial markets. And it did so through quantitative easing, where basically the government the Bank of England created money and used it to buy certain assets, which then that money ended up going into the hands of the people who owned those assets. And they're kind of disproportionately likely to be investors who then went on to purchase other assets like housing, like equities in certain parts of the world. So what we saw was lots of money flooding into different asset markets, like the housing market, for example. And in that way, quantitative easing has been responsible for really pushing up asset prices and exacerbating wealth inequality. So we had, an increase in wealth and income inequality, actually, in the last 10 years since the financial crisis. And at the same time, it's made borrowing very cheap, but that hasn't helped ordinary people. Instead, it's largely helped people who already have lots of wealth and therefore find it quite easy to get a loan. So you've seen, lots of new lending going to landlords, and people who've been able to kind of draw down their pension to purchase buy-to-let properties has exacerbated these wealth inequalities, and also made our economy very fragile. So because it was very easy to borrow, and there wasn't really much dynamism in the real economy, lots of corporations ended up getting very heavily indebted. So very heavily indebted corporations, obviously not what you want when you're about to go into a pandemic, when these companies are going to be facing perhaps quite a substantial loss of income. So we had all these pre-existing problems, high levels of inequality, the disempowerment of workers relative to capital, a big buildup of debt in the economy more broadly, in the corporate sector, this kind of program that the government had been pursuing, which was this combination of austerity and quantitative easing that had generated a lot of these instabilities, these inequalities, and really just showed that government intervention often operates on the sides of big business and financial interests rather than working people. Now, that is obviously not what we want in response to this crisis. So how can we try and build support for a different kind of model? Now, I think a lot of what we could be arguing for can be kind of subsumed under the mantle of this idea of the Green New Deal, right? And the reason for that, I think, is that the Green New Deal can be used as an answer to three of the biggest crises that we have in British society, more generally, not just the economy. So we have a crisis of living standards, which is what I've just been talking about, which has to do with low wages, with high levels of inequality. We have a crisis of representation, which is about the fact that people don't really trust our political institutions very much anymore. And we have a climate breakdown, which is obviously the big overarching crisis that is affecting everyone all over the world. So how do we deal with those interlinked crises of living standards, representation, and climate breakdown? We need a plan that is based around the principles of the socialization of ownership. So that deals with those issues around inequality by making sure that more people own things in common. Democratization, which answers that problem of representation by getting more people involved in the system, by making sure that people feel as though their voices are heard, and indeed that their voices are heard. And finally, decarbonization. So weaning our economy off a dependence on fossil fuels. Now, all of those things can, in one way or another, be subsumed under this idea of the Green New Deal. And it's the perfect time to be arguing for it, because when the pandemic itself ends, we're going to be going into the kind of recovery phase, right? And this is where all the mistakes, well, not all of them, but a lot of them were made last time, because we went for austerity and QE rather than a kind of expansive program of state-led investment that brought in kind of different areas of the public sector, different areas of the state, and different areas of society. And that's, I think, what the Green New Deal can be this time. We know just in a kind of basic economic sense that green stimulus packages create 3 times as many jobs as brown stimulus packages. So if you're going to have a recovery program, it makes sense to orient it towards decarbonization because it creates more jobs. It also makes sense to, if you're thinking about these kind of big mission of decarbonization, to also think about the socialization of wealth. So about making sure that the institutions and assets that we're using in this process of decarbonization are held in common, basically so that we can all collectively steward our resources in a way that is oriented towards kind of long-term sustainability, rather than having them parceled off into different private sector institutions where they're just purely exploited for the purposes of maximizing profit. And so that really requires a kind of nationalization of, energy, of certain areas of the transport system, for example, of certain utilities, so that they can be oriented towards this overarching goal of decarbonization. And then under that mantle of decarbonization, there's a lot you can do in terms of investment in research and development of green technologies, investing in retrofitting housing, and decarbonizing the transport system, the energy system, etc. And on top of all that, I think we need to make sure that this whole program is based on the principles of democracy. So it's based on the idea that you're extending the principles of political democracy into the realm of the economy. So it's not just the state saying, this money goes here, this money goes there. You're actually having kind of decentralized decision-making processes. So you're having this happening at a local and a regional level. You're having ordinary working people's voices being represented in big institutions like the Bank of England, like the Treasury, and you're creating new institutions that can be governed based on these democratic principles. So, for example, a national investment bank, right, that could be governed based on, a kind of democratic governance structure. And then, of course, also thinking about kind of democratizing the economy, principally by empowering the trade union movement, which, is something that, that's largely the biggest factor that's responsible for the falling labor share of national incomes and the falling amount of income in the economy that's going to workers rather than bosses. So there's a lot that can be done. There are some quite easy, actually, arguments to be made. You know, when you're thinking about the Green New Deal, you know, it's very easy just to say this is going to create 3 times as many jobs than a Brown stimulus program, to say that, you know, we need investments in decarbonisation if we are going to prevent pandemics like this from happening again, and if we're going to kind of steward our environment more responsibly and more effectively. The real challenge, I think, is building up a movement that's able to push in that direction. And yeah, this is the kind of the challenge that the left, and indeed society as a whole, faces today, right? Because we have a kind of environmentalist movement that has done a lot of interesting and good stuff, like School Strikes for the Future, for example, and Extinction Rebellion obviously made a big impact, which isn't a kind of mass movement. Equally, we have the Labour movement, which is, you know, has been disempowered and is often not that well integrated into these other movements. And we have all these various social movements, and then we have the Labour Party, right? And yeah, I mean, and then we have kind of other organizations, like, for example, tenants unions, right, which are going to be really, really important in this evictions crisis that we're facing, and political organizations like Momentum. And I think, you know, if we're going to be arguing for something as expansive as the Green New Deal, we need to link up. And this is going to be really, really important because, you know, we are going into a very, very critical moment in the development of capitalism. And if we don't speak with one voice, if we aren't clear as socialists, and indeed, you know, as progressive liberals, as a much wider coalition, that we need to answer this crisis with a call for decarbonisation, democratisation, and the socialisation of wealth, then this moment will pass us by, and we will end up with another lost decade, because, you know, the Tories will do it, and they will probably be able to get away with it by just saying, oh, you know, the economic problems that you're seeing aren't down to us, they're down to migrants and people trying to cross the channel, and, you know, like black folks who are like, you know, complaining about how our economy and society is racist, which, you know, according to the Tories is obviously ridiculous, right? So they'll create all these different scapegoats who can take the blame for these economic issues, which will ultimately, you know, ultimately it has worked, right? Unless the left is able to articulate a real strong and powerful alternative. So for me, yeah, I mean, a lot of this can be subsumed under the idea of the Green New Deal. The arguments are there. It makes sense. It makes sense from just like a basic mainstream economics perspective. The issue that we have is not kind of making the arguments that effectively, you know, we need to do that, but what we really need to do is build power. So I think we can maybe talk about that in the discussion. I'll leave it there because I've probably been talking for too long now, and hand over to Becky.
Thanks so much, Grace. That was like a kind of like overview of loads of different bits, and totally fantastic. I'm now going to introduce Rebecca Long-Bailey MP, who's a completely formidable campaigner, and obviously lots of people will know her as the architect of Labour's Green Industrial Revolution policies, which, you know, I think people still like underestimate to what extent like Labour with Becky in the Bayes role, Shadow Bayes role, was totally like, was just people around the world were looking at and saying how brilliant those policies were in terms of like how worked up they were and how far-sighted. So I'm really, really happy to introduce Becky now.
Well, thanks very much, Sian. It's an absolute pleasure to be on tonight with yourself and Grace, who's an absolute superstar. I've got Grace's book. If you've not got it, get it. It's a really good read. You get some really good ideas from it, and I might have to plagiarise parts of it for some of my speeches in Parliament, just warning you, Grace. But I'll try not to rant too much about coronavirus, but I'm going to have to start by ranting about coronavirus, because I did a speech today on the shambles of the government's tier system and the lack of support that they were providing, not just to Greater Manchester, but to anywhere that was falling under tier 2 and tier 3. And the sums that were requested by Greater Manchester leaders, it's important to remember that there were a speck compared to the millions that have been given by the government to the likes of Serco, G4S, KPMG, Deloitte and other private firms. And it was a tiny speck of the 745 billion of quantitative easing that was announced in June by the government, which was supposedly to be set aside to support our economy. Now, in Greater Manchester, we're in a terrible situation, as I'm sure many areas are across the country. We've got 408,000 people who were accessed the furlough scheme since it started months ago. We've seen unemployment double between March and May. We saw an increase in universal credit claimants of 76% between March and September. And my office has been inundated on a daily basis with people who've been simply excluded from any government support at all, insecure workers, freelancers, small businesses, new starters, those on PAYE. The list is endless, and there's over 3 million of those people nationally who haven't been able to access anything. And if they face the prospect of going into tier 3, it's going to be a very bleak and dark winter for them. And what worries me is that we've got many of our communities who they've struggled on for the last few months. They've done everything that was asked of them. When we went into the national lockdown, everybody stayed at home. When we started to ease restrictions, but have restrictions in other areas, they did what they were told. But as a result, they suffered financial hardship, and they thought eventually it will come to an end. So it's worth us doing this. It's worth us taking these hits to protect each other. And a lot of people will have racked up a large proportion of debt on their credit cards, household bills, which if they have to face another 6 months of, it's going to be unsustainable. Many people won't be able to secure any more credit for a start. They'll start defaulting on their household bills, their mortgage payments, their rent payments, and we're going to start seeing people losing their homes, unfortunately. And there's a few truths that I think need to be told about the government's tier system approach. The first is the amounts of support that they're actually providing to certain regions. So in the case of Greater Manchester, yesterday, I'm sure many people saw the news that the government refused to agree on a package with Labour and Tory leaders as well, right across GM. And the eventual sum that was put on the table was 60 million, which was absurd, given that leaders had actually costed just to provide furlough support at 90 million for Greater Manchester. Now, they provided quite detailed costed plans, the Greater Manchester leaders, but the government didn't even examine them, ask any questions, or actually provide any counter proposals or plans of their own. There's also a truth in that in Manchester and in many areas right across the country, those that have been on tier 2 for months now, we were told that if we did it, it would bring infection rates down. And in many areas, we've actually seen quite the opposite. In Salford and Manchester, we've seen infection rates soar under tier 2. And then the next point, and this is one of the most worrying points, because the government tried to push the comments of Van Tam, who did the media round last night for the government, who said that he didn't think that it was appropriate to have a circuit break lockdown and that the tiered system was the best approach. Well, only last week, not the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, which is what I understand Van Tam is, but the Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, said specifically, he said, I'm not confident, and nor is anybody confident that the tier 3 proposals for the highest rate, if we did the absolute base case and nothing more, would be enough to get on top of it. And that's a view that's shared by other members of the government SAGE committee. It's also important to note that the SAGE committee advised the government in September, and I understand continues to advise them, that a short national circuit break lockdown is still the best way of reducing infection rates. So it's a shambles from start to finish. And unfortunately, we've seen this the right way through the pandemic, and we've ended up with, quite frankly, what is some of the worst pandemic management in the world. And just as a brief recap as to everything that we've been through and how we actually ended up with one of the most acute infection rates in the whole of Europe at the moment. Well, we started after the initial lockdown with the promise that any semblance of normality was going to be predicated on a comprehensive test, track and trace system. We didn't see that. We saw people having to make 180-mile round trips just to get a test, and that's if they were lucky. Then we had the schools debacle. We had trade unions pleading with the government to listen to them about their valid safety concerns, and they were dismissed as wanting to be obstructive and not wanting children to go back to school. The guidance that the government issued was changed over 41 times. It wasn't clear to many teachers, teaching assistants or school leaders as to what they were actually expected to do. And now, as you've seen in many areas, there's raft upon raft of school closures, classes having to self-isolate at home, and the government hasn't developed a sufficient package to be able to support those children at home by making sure that they all have access to laptops. To say that there's a scheme that they can access, but I've had reports in many cases that that's delayed and many children aren't getting the at-home support that they deserve. Then there was workplaces. We were told to go back to work. I think that lasted about 2 weeks when Boris Johnson got jittery about Monday and told everybody to get back to offices and get back to work, only to realise that that was the worst possible idea he could have ever had, and then told everybody to go back home again if you could work from home. But for the workers that can't work from home, and this was true all the way through the lockdown and the easing of the lockdown, they were told when they went back into their workplaces that they should just speak to their boss and ask them to make sure that it was COVID secure, and that to report any problems. Now, the likelihood is with so many insecure workers, they're never going to report a problem because they'll be frightened of losing their jobs. And with funding from the Health and Safety Executive having been slashed over the last 10 years, most workplaces can't expect a visit from the HSE to assess that everything's okay. And then there's the point about financial crises that's impending that Grace has touched upon very articulately. Now, we've been told, and you know, there's a certain degree of truth in it, that we're facing one of the worst financial recessions that we've ever seen. And it doesn't have to be like that, and I'll come on to how we can avoid that in the next section. But it's understandable to kind of realise why a lot of people feel faced with the harrowing choice of keeping themselves healthy or going to work, when they think that the next 6 months, the next 12 months potentially could leave them financially destitute. And that's not a choice that anybody should be forced to make. And that argument runs into the tiered system, really. We're told that in order to protect the economy as a whole, it's necessary to lock down very stringently certain regions of the UK, so hamper their economic ability to the benefit of the rest of the country. But that won't work either, unfortunately, because we know coronavirus doesn't have a boundary. It doesn't stop at the boundary of Greater Manchester and think, right, well, I better not cross over the line because that's not tier 3 and this is tier 3. It will still spread if people travel around the country. And given that the government has said very clearly that you're allowed to travel outside of a tier 3 area for work purposes, people are still going to be moving around the country. So not only are you going to damage those local economies, but the wider economies that sit next to them are going to be impacted as well as the virus spreads. Now, at the crux of this is what you think the government should do. And there's been an argument that's running through everything since the beginning of this pandemic. It's what's more important, protecting lives or protecting the economy. And it's not a choice that we should have ever had to make. Lives should be our priority, and we should be building an economic model around that to ensure that we can keep people safe. And unfortunately, if you choose the economy or lives, then you're detrimenting each of those anyway. So they need to go hand in hand, and only a radical long-term economic response is going to be able to have any chance of protecting both. And there's 3 key elements that I want to touch on today in terms of that economic package that we need to see. Firstly, it's workers' rights. The rights of workers have got to be strengthened, and that means introducing sectoral collective bargaining. It means restoring and expanding trade union rights. It means creating a single status of worker. It means boosting the minimum wage, reducing working hours, and establishing a minimum income guarantee for all workers. I'd also go as far as to say that we need to be introducing a jobs guarantee as a result of this pandemic. And of course, we need to be making sure that all workers who were impacted by the pandemic, whether they're in an area that has to close businesses or whether those businesses haven't closed but are just detrimentally impacted, they should be receiving their income at this time. Secondly, the safety net that people need to protect themselves from this pandemic. It's got to be provided without equivocation, and that means a proper job support scheme. It means banning evictions. It means ensuring that the 3 million people who've been excluded from government support, like many of my constituents, are included. It means decent sick pay, the right to work from home where this is possible, and it means stringent health and safety measures where it's not, where these measures are assessed by a local assessor to make sure that workplaces really are COVID secure. And of course, most importantly, because we all want to get back to normal, it means properly resource, test, track, trace, and isolate. There's another point in terms of support, because often we talk about the personal support that people get, but very little about the support that wider industries get. And I would say that we need to be more vocal about supporting sectors and businesses to protect jobs. But in return for that, we need to be imposing conditions like good treatment and pay of workers, trade union access, carbon reduction, and even taking public equity stakes in these large businesses who receive bailouts. And then the final point is the $1 million question. So if we're going to provide people with the economic support that they really need to either go through a short circuit break if there's more than one, or to go through tier 3 if we still stay under the government's tier system, that's going to cost an awful lot of money if we truly protect people's incomes and livelihoods in the way that the government should be morally obliged to do. So we need to set out a plan to rebuild the economy so that we can increase growth, productivity, GDP, so that the government will eventually see a return on the amount of money that it's spending out on providing that support. And that requires the biggest industrial plan the country's ever seen, from sector-specific plans to building public infrastructure projects to keep the economy going as we do recover, from renewables to medicines to manufacturing. We need to lead the world with local, detailed industrial strategies on these areas and education guarantees to match them. And one small part of that industrial plan is the Green New Deal that Grace has already touched on. And I'm sure many people watching this are already aware that before the last general election, we knew the power of a Green New Deal. And it wasn't just about tackling climate change, which we've got a moral duty to do and to do very urgently, but we saw the opportunities that that could bring to reindustrialise areas that had been deindustrialised for 40 years, that have the hope sapped out of them, the aspiration and the future of generations to come. And we found that we could develop the most radical feasible pathway to decarbonise the energy system by 2030. We found that it would be a catalyst for manufacturing, for rebuilding deindustrialised towns across the UK. And we also found that not just morally, but economically, the most viable way to do this was to make sure that right at the heart of that Green New Deal was a plan to restructure and rebalance the economy as we know it, using elements of public ownership to drive the change we needed to see and to redistribute prosperity to those who needed it. And one example I'll give of an idea that we had was taking a majority public stake in new wind farms, where that would give us the power to support local businesses in the supply chain to make sure that we were supporting jobs in our local areas. We could ensure that all workers in that supply chain were on decent pay because we had a majority share in the wind farm company. And then we could ensure that the profits that that wind farm made went back into our communities, either to bring people's bills down or to invest in local infrastructure like new parks and new town centres and things like that. And the work that we did then showed that we needed to invest an average of about 1.9% of GDP each year on energy alone, and we'd have actually seen a net benefit to the UK economy of 800 billion by 2030, and it would have created 850,000 new jobs across the green energy sector. And as I say, that's just on energy. It doesn't tackle all of the other elements of a green industrial revolution. And I think it was Goldman Sachs who were, not your usual kind of socialist cheerleaders, but they found a few years ago that there was $16 trillion to be made worldwide in a Green New Deal. So businesses know this, and the governments need to catch up, because we've got to make sure that the investments that we make publicly as part of a Green New Deal, they're done in a way that rebalances our economy, and that we ensure that those investments actually drive up the quality of life of people here across the UK. So that's all I wanted to say, really, because I know that we'll have a lot of questions, but just to take everybody back to depression again. We're here now on Wednesday, the 21st of October. There's no plan to rebuild and restructure the economy at the moment, as we know it. We know that the Chancellor of the Exchequer has put some figures on the table in terms of his Green Industrial Revolution, which he pinched from us, by the way, that name. That was ours first. But it's nowhere near the amounts that other countries in the EU are putting on the table for green growth. There's no plan, as I can see it, to really keep people genuinely safe from this deadly virus. And there's less than adequate support for those who are going to be impacted as a result of the government's plans on the tiered system so far. And in the midst of this gross negligence, the government is now trying to lure local authorities into accepting paltry deals to ensure that they are now complicit in what's going to happen in our communities. The people deserve better. I'm sure everybody on this call agrees with that. They deserve safety and they deserve support. So it's up to us not just to hold the government to account, but to set out a plan now for economic reform and rebuilding our economy to show that there is a way to do it better.
Thanks so much, Becky, for that kind of like massive overview of everything. We've had loads of questions in. So before I start putting those to you both, I'm going to introduce very quickly Matt Wilgress to give our speakers a couple of minutes. Matt Wilgress, who's the coordinator of Arise, for a quick announcement. Matt. Massive overview of everything.
Hello, I'm hoping this is work. I'm getting a bit of feedback. Nod if you can hear me, Grace. I'll be very quick because we've got two people who are a lot more interesting than me on today. There's over 600 of you watching now, and as some of you will know, we're doing this quite a lot through Arise and associated groups, and that's really important. So I just wanted to talk about a couple of action points, and of course, as usual, ask for your donations, because all of these things we are putting on do cost money. Our first key action point to take out from today in terms of Labour Party activities, please, if you haven't already, vote for the Grassroots Voice 6 candidates for Labour's NEC, and also don't remember the other votes to vote for left candidates in Wales if you're there for the NEC. Ellen Morrison, who is absolutely fantastic, for the first ever disabled members representative, Laura McNeil, who speaks at a number of events for the youth representative, and also the Socialist Future slate for Young Labour, if you're lucky enough to be young enough for that. The second thing is, please do follow the links in the chat to our media partner, Labour Outlook. We're now absolutely delighted to have monthly columns from John Trickett, John McDonnell, Apsana Begun, Kate Osborne and Richard Bergen as our voices from Parliament, and that's updated every day. And just in the last week, we had over 80,000 people visit that website and over 70,000 people engage with our Facebook. So it really is going somewhere. So please do keep involved with that. And if you want to watch something interesting on that, at the YouTube channel that a lot of you are on tonight, the Arise YouTube channel, there's a premiere video of an interview between Laura McAlpine and Jeremy Corbyn for Labour Outlook on Task for Socialists at the moment. You can tune into at 6 p.m. tomorrow, Thursday. Third, quickly here, please do, if you haven't already, share and sign the People's Plan that was mentioned at the start of the meeting. Over 11,000 Labour members have now signed this, and we want to get it up to 20,000 soon as possible. And you'll also see in the chat an event at the end of November with John McDonnell about that plan. And then finally, as I said at the start, please do use the links provided to donate. Zoom webinar is an extremely expensive system, but it is enabling us to do quite remarkable things, including hosting events for other groups. We hosted an event for Friends of Bolivia with simultaneous translation the other day, for example, and we want to be able to keep paying for Zoom webinar and also for our email system, our website and so on. So please do donate £20 now or what you can afford, and thank you everyone.
Thanks, Matt. And the first kind of like, a lot of the questions that we're getting, pick up on kind of like the note that Becky ended on, and sort of some of the themes that Grace picked up on in terms of the type of alliances we need and how we build power. So a lot of the questions are basically along the lines of, people are desperately in need now, we can't wait until 2024. So what type of alliances do we need? How do we build a movement that can put pressure on this government, can extract sort of some of the kinds of like wins and support that people desperately need? And kind of linked to that is a question from Annette, which is about what type of language, how should we best be communicating our plans and ideas to kind of as part of winning and building that support. So I don't know if Grace, if you want to come in first maybe on that.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think the question about movement building is really important, actually. And I know that a lot of people in the Labour movement, in Momentum, in the party as well, are thinking quite hard about this. There was a really good interview last night with James Schneider on Novara Media, where he talked about a lot of these issues and how you might think about linking up these different kinds of movements, which is really, I think, that should be the priority for the left today. We obviously have, decentralized sources of energy that need to be translated into institutional power. So, from environmental movements through to the Black Lives Matter movement, through to tenants unions, through to, the Labour movement is more institutionalized, but there's still a lot of activity that's going on in workplaces that maybe isn't being, as I said, translated into those kind of that kind of institutional longevity. And obviously, we have a battle going on within the Labour Party as well. Obviously, the NEC elections are coming up, as Matt's just mentioned all of what's going on in the party at the moment. I think there's another thing that's going on at the moment, which is the left still obviously has a lot of power in the Labour Party, but we're not going to CLPs, we're not able to submit motions, conference didn't happen, so that power isn't really being able to be articulated. And I think that will obviously change in the years to come when we're able to have meetings in person again, we're able to have conference again. So it's really a question of making sure that we're very well organised for that. In terms of how we link up all of those different movements, this has been the question for the left since time immemorial. And I think, there was some hope that Momentum might begin to play this role. I don't think we've seen any clear initiative from Momentum on that front yet. Obviously, there's a new NCG and now a new political coordinator, so maybe that will be something that comes out. But really, we need to be putting pressure on people in positions of leadership in these organisations, in Momentum, in the Labour movement, in the SCG, Socialists in Parliament, to kind of just work together, right? It would be so powerful if we just had the ability to kind of coordinate some lines amongst all those people that have institutional power, who have voice in the media, who have a voice in Parliament, to be able to say, look, we need to extend the evictions ban, we need to, more support if the furlough scheme is going to be ended, and we need to make sure that when this crisis ends, we have a Green New Deal. Also, what I think was been interesting as well has been, and this was kind of touched upon in the question, I wrote a piece today talking about the potential power of local and regional government in the UK. Now, obviously, the kind of new metro mayors were created by a Tory government, and I wrote about this a bit in the piece, based on the premise that they would kind of basically act as like one half of a public-private partnership in various different parts of the UK, right? And I think, there's a lot of potential in those units because they do have some real power, but perhaps that potential hasn't really been realised yet. And I think what we've seen over the last couple of days with Andy Burnham, really actually using his platform and his power to stand up to the government and say, there is an alternative way of organising the economy. We can support people on low incomes. We can do things quite differently. Shows the potential of what those regional government structures could look like. Really interested in terms of articulating that there is an alternative. I think the left needs to be, and often we kind of don't really think that much about local and regional governments when we're thinking about our campaigning efforts, but engaging with combined authorities, engaging with with regional government structures in London, in Manchester, in the West Midlands, in all different parts of the country, could potentially be quite transformative. I wrote in this article all the ideas around the Preston model and how that could be incorporated into a program for a kind of local or regional Green New Deal, even if the national government doesn't do that. So I think it is quite important for us to be putting pressure on those politicians at the local and regional level, as well as politicians and leaders of the Labour movement and leaders of social movements and the Labour Party itself.
Thank you, Grace. And Becky, do you want to come back on some of those points as well?
Thanks. No, I agree with everything that Grace has said. There's a few other points. In terms of what action we can take now, it's quite a basic point, really, because no MP wants to upset their constituents generally, unless they're, a really bad person. They'll want to make their constituents happy. And one of the best ways of convincing an MP to do something who isn't really, what shall I say? Try and word this carefully, hasn't developed their own kind of set of clear political values, shall we say, is to bombard them with emails. And that requires a campaign. And there's so many votes over the last few years where I know that MPs have become jittery because they've had hundreds of emails like, how are you voting on this? Because I've had hundreds of emails about that. And it makes them start to think about whether they're actually representing their constituents in the way that they should or not. Yeah. So that campaigning power shouldn't be underestimated. I think we need to do a lot more of that on everything from pernicious pieces of legislation that are coming through. We've seen quite a few in the last few weeks, all the way through to the support packages the government should be providing and the wider economic plan that needs to be put on the table as quickly as possible. The linking up movement point is really important because sometimes there's a tendency for everybody to go off in different directions, and then we don't realise how powerful we can actually be. And sometimes it's right for independent groups to do their own thing and for us to just come in behind them. But sometimes we need to recognise that they've got to be meshed together in a wider movement. So on the economic picture, for example, everyone will have different theories about different things that we can do and packages that we can put in place and policies that we should be pushing for. But we need to have one unified voice on the left, if you like, sometimes. And that requires an economic forum, in my view, that brings all the different elements of these groups that have been talking about these issues together and says, look, we're going to have the biggest impact if we have one list of things that we're asking for. Let's agree what those things are that we can all agree on. And let's really push hell for leather and make sure we pressure the government and other politicians into agreeing to that. Then the other thing is about trade unions, because we can't underestimate the power that trade unions have. They're a ready-made movement, and at every opportunity, we should be encouraging people that we can see becoming political to become members of trade unions. And that's what I always try and do if we're talking to community activists about things. I'll say, well, you thought about, you'd be good in a trade union and you'll get special help and training to be able to develop the skills that you've clearly got. And it's really important for them to develop within a trade union, and they'll realise, how far further they can go, really.
Thank you, Becky. So I think the kind of like the next batch of questions really picks up on a couple of those different things as well. I think especially because of what's in the news and anti-Burnham, and also the action the government is threatening against TfL and so on. There's quite a lot of people asking about when politicians talk about regional inequality and levelling up, they often mean quite a narrow focus on reallocating of resources within the existing system. But actually, what should the left's version of levelling up look like, and how do we redistribute power to empower different communities and different levels of regional government? And I think linked to that, and again, another issue that you both touched on, but I think people want to dig into a little bit more is, Becky, you mentioned obviously Serco and their kind of total failure really to provide a proper test and trace system, which is really hampering how we're dealing with the virus. But also obviously that's a massive failure of privatisation, and surely that provides a big opportunity to push on the need for insourcing public services and the role of and the role of public ownership. So I just didn't know if there were a couple of comments that you both wanted to make very quickly on those two issues, just because I think there's such kind of big themes that people are talking about at the moment.
Yeah, I think I can actually answer those two questions together, because I think, you've got two models for kind of economic planning at the local and regional level. One of them is, I actually said this in this piece I had today, it's the Serco model versus the Preston model. So it's outsourcing versus a kind of model of municipal socialism or community wealth building, or whatever you want to call it. And the outsourcing agenda has dominated local councils and actually regional authorities to an extent as well for a very, very long time. I mean, even Labour councils, there has been a lot of pressure on councils, obviously, to cut costs, and often the easiest way to do that has been to outsource service provision to the private sector, even though actually that's often more expensive over the long term. So yeah, I mean, we've seen a kind of erosion of the local state, which was obviously done deliberately in part, and you can trace this back to the 1980s when there were many local councils that obviously did pose something of a kind of counterweight to the power of Westminster, and they were really kind of that power was removed deliberately. So this neoliberal model, which is basically what is behind the conservative devolution agenda, it's behind this kind of northern powerhouse agenda, right? And it's based on the idea of kind of promoting spatial efficiencies, I suppose. So this is the idea that we need regional governance structures to make sure that private businesses have the infrastructure and the political networks in place that they need to make money as efficiently as possible. And those governance structures should be oriented towards supporting the private sector. So that's why I kind of said that they often, these governance structures often look like one half of a public-private partnership. They're often there to kind of give tax breaks to businesses, outsource local services, that sort of stuff. So that's one model. But the other model, which is being pioneered by local authorities like Preston, is this model of community wealth building, where you're trying to create and retain value locally in a way that benefits everyone, not just kind of landlords and big business. And so you actually can see the way in which authorities like Preston have tried to socialize ownership and democratize their economies locally, because rather than outsourcing services to Serco or Capita or whatever, they've supported the creation of cooperative enterprises that can bid for those contracts. They have prioritized local businesses with good standing on workers' rights and that sort of thing. And extending that, there's all sorts of ideas for kind of community banking systems, for kind of working with anchor institutions, so institutions that can't move, in order to kind of retain value locally rather than letting it be sucked out by the very wealthy. So I mean that model of kind of municipal socialism or community wealth building is something I think we should really be pushing at the local and regional level, especially given that even though the election is 4 years off, the left doesn't want to completely lose sight of electoral politics. Obviously, it's very important to be organising outside of the Labour Party, to be organising outside of the state, but we don't want to completely lose sight of a focus on state power. And I think that focusing on kind of regional and local government can be a way around that. So I mean, that is, I think promoting that model would be one way of kind of re-empowering regional authorities, as well as pushing back against that outsourcing agenda, because a lot of those services that are really heavily outsourced are outsourced at the local level.
Thank you. Becky, do you want to come back on any of those points?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think it's not so much levelling up that's the issue, it's the fact that levelling up in of itself isn't really going to give us the change that we need to see in many of our regions and nations. And what we need to be asking for is fundamental economic reform. And Grace has touched on a couple of the points already. What we need to see is a presumption in areas in favour of public ownership, particularly insourcing local authority functions, NHS functions. We also need to see public ownership to an extent driving investment in public infrastructure so that we can see those projects delivered at pace, and with the support for workers and the wider business community in there, enshrined in those packages and in those contracts that we deliver. We also need to see corporate reform overall. And at the moment, particularly with bigger companies, they owe their duty to shareholders, not to the wider community, not to their workforce. And I think that needs to change. And one thing that myself and John McDonnell and the Treasury team used to talk about was having a gold standard system for businesses, like an accreditation system as a starting point for businesses that were acting in a corporate moral way, that were treating their workers well, that were making sure that they were adhering to green principles and reducing carbon where that was possible, that they were engaging with local businesses in their supply chain where that was possible to support the wider local economy. But I think we need to see a change in corporate legislation as well beyond that, so that there is not just a duty owed to shareholders, it's owed to the wider community and to everybody that's affected by that particular company, including the workforce. I think we also need to deal fundamentally with prosperity and where that actually filters through to, because there's no point in levelling up a region if that levelling up doesn't reach the workforce or the communities in which it's located. And at the moment, I'm afraid it wouldn't. So we've got to see protection for workers. We've got to see trade union representation in all workplaces so that conditions can be bargained for on a sector or collective basis. And we've also got to see a minimum income guarantee for all workers and everybody across the UK, so that there's a standard of living that's guaranteed for everyone. I'd also say that we need to be encouraging a lot more vigorously. We tried to do that over the last few years, alternative models of ownership, to make people realise that there's other ways of structuring businesses than the tried and tested methods. So cooperatives that Grace has touched on, employee ownership schemes that would give workers more of a say in that particular company, but would also ensure that the proceeds of that company actually went to the workforce and not just to a small proportion of shareholders overall. The point about local authorities, I think local authorities do need more economic and political power, particularly economic power. We talk a lot about devolution, but we've not really seen any real devolution of economic power. We've seen devolution of cuts over the last 10 years, and we saw the government try to devolve the blame for the mismanagement of the coronavirus crisis in the last 24 hours, but we're not seeing that being matched with the real economic power that needs to be seen in regions. And one example that I'll give is that, you know, my own local authority, we've got a housing company that's been set up by the council in Salford. And they've been building council houses, but they're trying to operate within a business model because they're trying to make it profitable so they can build more houses. When really what they need to be given from government is some investment so that we can deal with our housing crisis, build the council homes that people need so that we can make sure that everybody's secure and happy within the city. And we're not seeing that, and that's the kind of economic support that I think many of our local authorities would need. And then finally, and this is the most important point about levelling up really, it's about regional and national industrial strategies. What we've seen over the last 10 years is the government talk about industrial strategy, but not really have a strategy. So they'll throw money at particular sectors and have sector plans here and there, but there's no matching together of particular regions and nations. And it's right that areas should, you know, be the authors of their own destiny, if you like. But there also needs to be a national framework, because not every single area is going to have a big spangly new industry. And we've got to make sure that those areas that don't have digital, don't have a new wind farm, don't have a new car factory, don't have a steel plant, etc., that they have a different industry that's located in their region that can support local businesses in that region. And we've not seen a plan at that scale before. And that's the type of thinking that I want government to do, because if they're serious about levelling up, they'll have those local and national industrial strategies. And they'll also set up regional offices in every region, in my view, dedicated to industrial strategy.
Thank you, Becky. Before I go back to both of our speakers for a final time, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's participated tonight, and just to also say I think it's so brilliant to have like two women economists talking with such knowledge and passion about the economy and how we can change it. and make it better for everyone. I just think that's like been a massive thing that's changed over the past few years. It's just hearing so many great voices on the left. Like we've heard tonight and at other events, how we've got really, really important battles ahead and how important our campaigning is. So I just wanted to give a final plug to say to people to donate at the link so that we can keep having these events and bringing speakers together. The next Arise event is on November 5th at 7 o'clock, and that's going to be Jeremy Corbyn and Rafael Correa, the former president of Ecuador, reflecting on the US presidential election results. Which kind of leads me to my final question, really. I was going to ask both speakers, first Grace and then Becky, to kind of sum up and give final remarks, saying kind of like one key reason why you think that we can be hopeful that the left can win a better world, so that we end on a positive note. So Grace first, then Becky.
I mean, I think it's important to bear in mind that obviously whilst we've suffered significant defeats, and I think the example of Ecuador there is really an interesting example of a left movement that gains state power, achieves a lot, falls back, but hopefully we will see it kind of rise from the ashes again. And I think, the thing we need to bear in mind is that the conditions that gave rise to Corbynism in the UK, to the Sanders movement in the US, to all the leftist movements that have cropped up around Europe and around the global South, they've not gone away. Inequality isn't getting better on its own. Climate breakdown isn't getting better on its own. This kind of corruption of our political institutions is not going to get better on its own. None of these things are going to get better on their own. They're going to carry on getting worse and worse and worse until we do something about it. And, I think fundamentally as socialists, we have faith in each other, and in the fundamental strength and power of movements of cooperative human beings who are able to push back against systems that try and exploit and oppress them. And as long as these problems continue to get worse, which really unfortunately they will, people are going to be standing up and fighting back against them. And that is the thing that we have to bear in mind is, we're fighting climate breakdown, we're fighting inequality, we're fighting corruption. The left is on the right side of history, and we will continue to fight against those things until we can build or at least see a path to a better world.
Becky?
Well, I think the coronavirus crisis has exposed the fragility of all of our lives, and it's quite clear that wherever you sit on the political spectrum, most people don't want to go back to what was before. Most people, no matter how well off they are, unless they come from extreme wealth, they're 1 or 2 paychecks away from destitution, and they understand that very acutely now. So the time is right for us to show how we can reform our economy and set out a plan of hope for them and their children, so that they don't have to live in fear of destitution, and that they'll be given the quality of life that they deserve. And it's not a case that we don't have the plans yet. We've been working on the plans for the last 5 to 10 years. We've got fantastic economists such as Grace, brilliant people like Sian, and people that I've worked with when I was in the previous shadow cabinet. So we've got those policy ideas. We've just got to bring them together now in one economic plan that gives people the hope that they need, so that we can start pressurising the government to take action on many of the things that we need to see action on now. Because if we don't, then quite frankly, many of our communities will see us not doing anything, and they'll lose hope in us. They'll think that we don't have the answers to the real problems that they face. So it's critical that we provide them with that hope. And I know that we all will, and that we can. So keep that flame of hope alive, because it's going to get better. Change is coming, as they say.
Thank you so much to Grace and Becky and everyone that took part tonight. I think it was such a fantastic discussion, and I look forward to seeing people virtually at the next Arise event.